Welcome to Siege, a podcast about Castles and Crusades and other Siege engine games. And, well, whatever the hell else we want to talk about. I'm your host, Sam, and I'm here with my co-host, George.
Hi.
And on this episode, we are going to talk about combat basics. That is, we're talking about the rules as written combat guidelines in Castles and Crusades in the player's handbook. Okay. This is going to be a multi-episode arc because we're going to try to keep each episode relatively short. So some things, I'm warning you now, some things we're going to mention, and then we're just going to say that's for a later episode because some of these items could take a great deal of conversation, and we're trying to just hit you with the basics in this episode. So, George.
Yes, Sam.
How long is a round in Castles and Crusades?
A round is 10 seconds long, which isn't a lot of time.
Now, when you compare it to something like 3rd, 4th, or 5th edition D&D, those games actually have 6-second rounds.
A lot quicker.
But how long was a round in 2nd edition?
1 minute.
Right. A lot slower.
Very much.
1st edition as well. So how do we know when you're supposed to go in a round?
Well, rules as written, we're going to roll a D10. And the person with the highest die roll is the first to go.
Now, do I add my dex to that?
You never add your dex.
In the case of a tie, the one with the highest dexterity goes first. That way you don't have to worry if you both have a +1 bonus, now what? One of you might have a +1 bonus because they've got a 13 dexterity, but another one of you might have a +1 bonus because you have a 15 dexterity. So if that's the case, the person with the 15 goes first, even though you have the same bonus. That's why they don't have you look at bonus. Do you want to talk about attack rolls?
Attack rolls. Attack rolls, there's 3 basic types. There's melee, ranged, and ranged thrown. Your basic melee attack is simply your D20 plus your base to hit, or BTH, plus your strength modifier, and any additional little odds and ends that might come into play, such as a fighter's bonus for weapon specialization.
Right. Or if you had a magic weapon or something. Or if you have a non-magic but expert weapon. Because if you have a non-magic but expert weapon, you can either choose to have that weapon give you a +1 to hit or a +1 to damage. So it's possible you might have one of those.
Well, and then we get into the ranged weapons.
Well, actually, I have a question for you first.
Oh?
What does BTH stand for, and how do I know what mine is?
Well, BTH is your base to hit, and that's located on each character in the player's handbook. So, for example, the fighter has a BTH on their chart of 1 at first level. It's one of the few character classes that actually has a +1 at first level. The rest of the characters in the player's handbook have a +0 at first level.
And because of that, the fighter has the best base to hit out of every class, all the way through every single level.
And in addition to that, their +1 for specialization actually gets them out ahead at +2.
Exactly. Yeah, so they definitely are the best fighter, which is great because that's the name of the class. But the point here is base to hit is something that is based on your class. So every class will have one, but sometimes it's just a +0.
Next up, we have ranged attacks. So we have non-thrown ranged attack, which would be perhaps with a bow or crossbow. And we also have ranged thrown, which is very similar. It's a D20 plus your base to hit, plus your dex modifier. The difference is that with a ranged thrown weapon, you add your strength modifier to the damage roll. And with ranged weapons, there's penalties for ranges. So, for example, if a creature is at a medium distance or medium range, it's a -2. If they're at long range, it's a -6. And Sam, what determines the ranges?
So the ranges for the weapons are all listed on the equipment lists, which are on page, I think, 101 to 103, and in the player's handbook, 8th printing. And basically all of the ranged weapons have a listed range. The thrown weapons also have a listed range, and that listed range is considered close range. And then 2 times that, or up to 2 times that, is medium range, and up to 3 times that listed amount is long range. So let's say the range is 20. That would be close range. And so you don't take a penalty when you're trying to use that weapon within that range. So if it's 20-foot range, you're using that weapon within 20 feet, no penalty. However, if you go between 20 and 40, so 21 to 40, you now are at medium range. So you're going to take a -2 to hit anytime you make an attack that's within that range. And if you go above 40 all the way to 60, so 41 to 60 in that case, then you're going to be at long range and you're going to take a -6 penalty to hit.
That's right. And just to call out that some weapons, such as the dagger and the club, are not listed under missile weapons, but they also have a range under the regular melee weapons.
Right. And that's their thrown range, correct?
Correct.
And thrown weapons still adhere to the short, medium, long range, or close range, medium, long range. If you imagine, you can throw a dagger at close range is 20 feet. You could probably throw a dagger 30 to 40 feet. That would be medium range. And you might be able to throw a dagger 60 feet. That would be long range.
Throwing a dagger 60 feet, that's quite a throw.
It is. But if you think about these fighters and rogues and paladins and whatnot, they're pretty good with weapons. So, So what about unarmed attacks? The thing about unarmed attacks, there are varieties of unarmed attacks. The first thing to notice is if you look in the equipment list, it actually lists fists as a weapon, which is good because fists can be weapons. They do 1d2 damage. You can actually use fists in a non-lethal manner or in a lethal manner. Okay, but that's not really the unarmed attacks that I'm talking about. What I'm talking about are these special combat unarmed attack moves that are on page 219 of the PHB. They are known as pummeling, grappling, and overbearing. And I'm not going to get into the details very deep because we're going to talk about these in a later episode because there are some peculiarities with these rules. But basically, they are relatively simple attacks. For pummeling, the idea is it's an unarmed attack. You're trying to inflict damage and you want to knock them out. So you're trying to incapacitate them without killing them. So you're basically going to do fist damage plus your strength modifier. And that is, by definition, non-lethal. So you don't even have to say non-lethal. It's just non-lethal. Grappling attacks is a special attack where you are trying to hold the opponent and subdue them. And then you could actually do an overbearing attack. If you have them grappled, you can end up knocking them to the floor. So there are these interactions between these. Basically, they're still attacks. You're still going to roll a d20. It's still going to be versus the AC of the opponent and things like that. But they have some special effects and special things that happen because of that particular activity. And there's some weird interactions with the trip rules. And so we're going to hold those off for a different episode. Remember, I warned you earlier that we're going to talk about some things and then we're just going to mention them. And so they do exist, but they just, unarmed attacks deserves its own episode. So we are going to set it aside. Just know that they exist. They're not all that difficult, but they do have some interesting interactions. So we're not going to talk more about those in this particular episode. Instead, we're going to move on to damage, bandages, and healing. So, George.
Yes, Sam.
What does it mean by natural damage?
Natural damage is what a creature would do with its claws or bite or any other attack that they have naturally.
Got it. So generally, natural damage is going to be something where a creature is using that. And most PCs are going to be using weapon damage. The exception to that is maybe the monk if they're using unarmed attacks, but point of clarity, the monk hand, if they're an unarmed monk, their hands are considered weapons and they do weapon damage. Natural damage is reserved for creatures. So what kind of bonuses do you add to your damage when you hit something and you're doing melee damage?
Typically, it would just be your strength modifier, if any. In addition to that, any specialization for a fighter or magic weapons, or perhaps a magical enhancement, such as a prayer spell.
Nice. Unarmed attack, just a regular melee fist attack, not pummeling, not the special movements. those things do 1d2 as listed in the equipment list, which, by the way, the damage that is done by each weapon might be different. You have to look in the equipment list to get that. And it's so damage is based on weapons. So some weapons do d4, some do 2d4, some do 1d6, 1d8, etc. The main difference between melee damage and range damage is melee damage, you add your strength modifier. And for thrown weapons, as George said earlier, you add your strength modifier. But for non-thrown ranged damage, because you're not applying your strength to the actual weapon projecting or propelling forward, it's actually the weapon that does that itself. So you don't add your strength damage to that. And you don't add your dexterity. In that case, you would add your dexterity to the attack, but not to the damage. It is possible that if your character is of a certain type, they could have extra attacks. Okay. So, for example, fighters get an extra attack, and most individuals don't get extra attacks unless they have something in their character class that lets them do that. But if you want to attack with two weapons, right? So it's actually considered a special combat maneuver, and you make your regular melee attack, but your regular melee attack is at a -3 for your main attack. And then you can make a second attack with your offhand weapon, but it's at a -6. So unless you have a special ability like the fighter, right? They have a multiple attack benefit built into their class progression. As they level up, they will get more attacks eventually. Those attacks don't take a penalty. So monks get a second attack as well later on, later than the fighter, I think even gets one. But in normal cases, all the other PCs, they don't get an extra attack. But if they choose to do some kind of dual wielding attack, that's called a 2-weapon attack. It's one turn, you make 2 attacks, you have to have a weapon in each hand, and you take a pretty heavy penalty to those attacks, to both of them, not just the second one, but both of them.
Are there any other penalties for using 2 weapons in your attack?
When using 2 weapons, the player must designate which hand is used for the primary attack and which is the off attack. So I think the answer is no. There is no other penalty. The ability to choose to do 2-weapon fighting, the only penalty, the only drawback is the -3, -6. Because the thing is that you take that no matter what. You know, it's not like, oh, I can use some kind of special proficiency or get some kind of special magic weapon. Like that's it. If you're using 2 weapons and you're making 2 attacks, you're going to take that penalty on both attacks.
So, Sam, I think we need to talk about this from the aspect of that it's 2 weapons, -3 and -6, and that a DM should determine how heavy or how large of an item that they can use. For example, they would not be able to dual wield 2 two-handed swords.
Right. Well, but by definition, though, because a 2-handed sword requires 2 hands to use. So, and with 2-weapon fighting, you have to have 2 different weapons.
Yeah.
So, what, George, is there something else about 2-weapon fighting? So there's no penalty for weapon size. You have to be reasonable about what weapons you allow the PC to use for this. And there's a -3 and a -6 penalty. But what else? Anything else?
Well, one of the most important parts is that the penalties are affected by the character's dex modifier. And the strength modifier only applies to the damage inflicted.
And that's different because normally in a melee attack, you roll a d20, you add your base to hit, and then you add your strength modifier. When you 2-weapon fight, it's no longer strength. Now it's dex.
You lose that. Well, you still keep that the strength damage, though, which I'm surprised.
You keep the strength damage. Yep. So that means that a person who wants to really do well dual wielding like that, they need to be high dex and high strength, which is not exactly common.
Not at all.
Right. So, yeah. So the thing about 2-weapon fighting is it's a very brief section of the book, and it's really only there, I think, because a lot of people asked for it. But the idea is the CK is going to have to make lots of adjudication about this. because there's no rule about how big or small the weapons have to be compared to each other or compared to the individual. In some other systems, there are rules about what the size of the weapon can be and that sort of thing. In here, there's not. They made it very simple. And the simple rule is you take a -3 for the first weapon, you take a -6 for the second weapon, and you have to be holding both weapons, which means you can't be using a shield, you can't have anything else in your hands, right? And you're still going to take those penalties even if you don't have anything else, right? So that's the baseline. The castle keeper is going to have to adjudicate any other question that comes out of this particular situation. The monk is a special case because they have, their sort of martial artistry, 2 weapons, both fists kind of thing is a separate thing. But for just a generic PC, even a fighter so let me just make this distinction. When they get multiple attacks per round, they just get more than one attack, but it's with the same primary hand, right? So if they're using like a longsword, they're just attacking with their longsword twice. A person doing 2-weapon fighting is not just attacking twice with the same weapon. They have to have 2 weapons. So that's why you take the penalty, because that is a very difficult style of fighting, despite, some popular media. So let's move on and let's talk about healing just in the very briefest of aspects. I only want to hit healing with respect to combat, because obviously in combat, the party is attempting to best the opponents. And if the opponents, when you take away all their hit points through damage and through spells and all that, then they're gone and that's fine. But what if a PC hits 0 hit points? What happens at 0 hit points, George?
Character simply goes unconscious, unable to act.
But are they dead?
They're not dead. Unconscious is not dead.
They are not dead. Now, if they get hit again and they end up at between -1 and -6 hit points, they are still unconscious, but now they are considered grievously wounded. Okay. So
yes,
that's fine. They'll have to get some bed rest and whatnot. If they hit -7 to -9, what happens?
They're starting to bleed out, losing 1 hit point per round, right, Samuel?
Yep.
Whoever's playing that cleric needs to get a first aid spell to them quick.
Right. And at -10, when they hit -10, they die. Okay.
Like really dead?
Like dead. Death occurs immediately, and the only thing that brings them back is resurrection, reincarnation. Right. So there's that. Now, there's one other thing other than that first aid spell or the cure wounds that you're talking about, the cure light wounds that you're talking about, and that is bandages. And unfortunately, bandages are listed in the equipment list for purchase, but the rules for using a bandage in combat and out of combat, by the way, are not in the player's handbook. They are in the supplemental book called The Adventurer's Backpack on page 66. So we're not really going to address them other than they have some requirements. If you're going to use them, they have to be fresh bandages. They have to have a healing salve on them, and they have to be applied to the individual within 4 rounds of the injury occurring. Otherwise, they cannot help that wound. Okay. The reason why there's a more extensive discussion there possible and a more extensive set of rules is because of what it means to be wounded versus injured versus how many rounds ago did that happen? How many hit points did it take? How do you make sure there's a healing salve on the bandages? And can you increase the healing from that? All of that, that's a much bigger conversation. And it is not for this episode because we are trying to keep the episodes short. So, and also we're doing rules as written PHB. Now that is already stepped out into the Adventurer's Backpack. So let's move on. And George, I want you to tell me about armor class. First of all, what is armor class?
Armor class is the difficulty to hit a creature or character. It's their natural defenses or armors, and sometimes includes their dexterity modifier. All depends on the conditions that they may have at that time.
Well, so normally you determine your regular sort of quote normal armor class by you start with 10, then you have your dexterity modifier, you apply that. And then you have, if you're wearing armor, you get an armor bonus, you apply that. And if you're using a shield, you get an extra +1. Because that's what a shield is worth. Now, if you're not wearing a helmet and something takes a headshot at you, specifically trying to damage your head, then your not going to get your armor bonus for that. So instead, your AC for that is a 10 plus your dexterity modifier. And if you have a helmet, there will be a helmet bonus, but otherwise that's it. If something makes a touch attack against you, which could happen a lot with spells, for example, then you don't get your armor bonus because it's just about touching you. So it's going to be 10 plus your dexterity modifier. So your dex mod helps in all of those cases. Okay. When you're surprised, if it's determined that you're surprised, which we didn't actually mention surprise because, again, that's another whole episode because of the way Castles Crusades does siege checks. But when you're surprised, if your party is surprised or if you're individually surprised, you lose your dexterity modifier for your armor to your AC. So your AC then is 10 plus the armor bonus, plus if you have a shield, plus 1. You lose your dex because you're surprised, so you're not able to move and dodge in the normal way that you would move and dodge. And the last thing that we wanted to talk about or mention in this episode are things called combat maneuvers. What are combat maneuvers?
Combat maneuvers are anything that will assist you in the combat round other than your basic attack or casting spells. So, for example, charging or evading or disengaging, or just even trying to defend yourself with an offensive focus, or parrying or making up a shield wall. Those are the combat maneuvers typically used.
There's also rear attacks, what you do when you receive a charge, pushing something, doing a flank, trying to disarm, tripping. But the difference between the things I listed compared to what George listed is that the ones that he listed are actions that you have to declare before you roll initiative. So in Castles and Crusades, normally you don't have to declare your actions. Like typically in a typical round, you just roll your D10 for your initiative. And when the CK gets to that number, you say, oh, I have a 6, I'm going, right? And you don't have to declare what you're doing. You don't have to tell anybody what you're doing first or before that, right? In some other games, you have to do that, right? Like in basic D&D, you had to declare. So before we even rolled initiative, you had to say, oh, my fighter is going to attack this person in front of them. And or oh, my magic user is going to go over there and then cast the spell, right?
Yeah, and that gives a lot of flexibility for the players.
Gives a lot of flexibility that you don't have to declare, except some combat maneuvers change your armor class. And if they change your armor class, you have to declare ahead of time. That way, if someone rolls initiative and they go before you do, then you don't get the benefit of the full armor class. You get the benefit of the armor class that has been changed. So, for example, if you do a hasty disengagement, you are hastily moving away from someone that you're already in melee combat with. You take a penalty to your AC because you're doing that. Okay. Basically, you're trying to get away from them so fast that you're not really defending yourself very well anymore. So you take a lower AC. Meanwhile, evading, you get a bonus to your AC, but you don't get to attack. But because you get a bonus to your AC, you need to declare that ahead of time so that anybody that's going to attack you, you get that bonus despite the fact that they went before you in initiative, right? In fact, I think if you evade, you don't even roll initiative because you're just evading.
That's correct.
So as you could see just from this discussion, some of these things, they get a little complex, right? And we didn't even define these things. Really, the only reason to bring them up is to show you that, you know, the game recognizes, the authors, the designers recognized that sometimes, you know, characters want a little more meaty kind of things that they could do rather than just, oh, I run up and swing my sword, right? So they're going to come up with innovative, creative actions. They're going to try to use a chair as a shield, or they're going to, you know, try to swing on a chandelier. And the CK is going to have to adjudicate all those things. And so to help with a little bit of that, the PHB gives a list of some things that are maybe kind of common or typical things that people ask about, things like, you know, flanking and making a shield wall or hitting somebody with your shield instead of your actual weapon and things like that. So they provide information about all of those things. Those are called combat maneuvers because they're over and above the sort of typical things, because ultimately the game is meant to be very simple. And in a combat round, you get to do one thing. You either get to attack, or you get to cast a spell, or you get to move, or you get to use if you have a class ability that would come into play, or you could use an item that happened to be in your hand or on your belt. And that's pretty much it. The only exception to that really is those combat maneuvers, which allow you to do something maybe more extravagant, like charging lets you move a lot and attack. Whereas generally, the only way you can attack is if you're not moving or if you only move up to half your speed, which is not very far. Other things you can't, for example, move and cast a spell. You can't move and use a class ability unless the movement is part of the class ability, like a rogue's climbing surfaces or something, right? So they're trying to provide you with enough guidance that you could do interesting, fun things, okay, as part of the combat, so they give guidelines for how, what the penalties or bonuses might be for those different things. Okay. And we didn't go over them in detail because we don't need to go over them in detail. You just understand that they exist, right? Okay. George, you have anything to add to that?
I'd like to, you brought up an interesting point in your descriptions there with the combat maneuvers. You referenced an idea of using a chair as a shield.
Mm-hmm.
That's very interesting. And I think that's something that you find in Castles and Crusades more than other games. Players wanting to do something like that. And I could see the DM or the CK trying to adjudicate that on the fly. I can see the chair being broken. Maybe it only lasts a round or two, but it gives them that +1.
Mm-hmm.
So very interesting, Sam.
Or maybe it gave him a +2 because of the legs of the chair, right? And that caused the blow to only be a glancing blow, but it broke the chair, right? And now the tavern keeper's mad at you because all the chairs are broken. But hey, you didn't take any damage.
Right. And it's almost a classic movie trope where players or the actors in the movie are picking up anything to stop or to protect themselves. Right. From that flurry of blows. I might have to see if any of my players start using a chair as a shield in combat.
Yeah, maybe I'll use one this week.
That would be awesome. I may remove all chairs from the game.
No chairs. You walk into the tavern and there's 5 tables and there are lots of people standing up boisterously, talking and drinking, and there's not a chair to be seen. Okay, well, that's basically going to wrap up the basics of combat. Again, there are lots of things we mentioned, and I had to say, well, we're going to talk about that later because it gets into a lot of detail and a lot of things that, as they come up, you sort of learn how the ebb and flow of the rules go, but we don't really have time to talk through all of that at the moment. So we wanted to just give you a very quick sort of rundown of what combat is. Rounds are 10 seconds. You roll a d10 for initiative, melee and ranged attacks and ranged thrown attacks, the fact that unarmed attacks exist, how basic damage works, right? Many of these things are relatively familiar to you. Even if you're new to C&C, if you've played another fantasy RPG, a lot of these will seem very familiar. And that's part of the idea of doing this episode is this is kind of the familiar stuff. There's still a few oddities, right? There's some oddities in there that are located in 2 or 3 places in the book and maybe not as easily found, like the range thing with the thrown weapons or with the ranged weapons. But ultimately, these things should feel very familiar. I want to end this talk about combat with one piece that sort of falls into that category. And that is something that is mentioned one time in the beginning part of the book and then never mentioned again, even though it's a pretty important, impactful thing. And that is also, I'm going to call it the fun fact of the episode. The fun fact of this episode is we have talked about using weapons and making melee attacks and making ranged attacks. What we didn't say is anything about proficiency. George mentioned the fighter's weapon specialization, which gives them an extra bonus to hit, but we didn't say anything about proficiencies. It turns out every class has a list of weapons that they are automatically proficient in. And some races have extras that they're proficient in based on the race, okay? But here's the thing. If you are using a weapon that you are not proficient with, you take a -4 penalty to your attack rolls. The problem is that's only printed, that's only mentioned in the book in one place, and that's on page 16 at the beginning of the class description section, when it tells you why it gives you a list of weapons for each class.
Yeah, that's a really small detail that's kind of hidden, Sam.
It's a really small hidden detail, but it's really important because it stops individuals from just picking up anything. Because the thing is, improvised weapons, that means you're not proficient with them. So we talked about picking up a chair and using it as a shield. What if I wanted to use that chair as a weapon? Well, that's a little bit different. Not quite as easy as using it as a shield, because now I'm wielding a weapon I am not proficient with, and I'm going to take a -4 to my attack roll.
And if I really wanted to push the limits of my DM and Castles and Crusades, if I played an elf, I would get a +1 to my dexterity. And if I had a really good dex, and I get a bonus to, let's say, a longsword, or even better, the longbow, I could use that and try to negate any penalties by using a bow as an elf wizard. Mm-hmm. That's one way to go about it.
The other way, multi-classing.
Oh my gosh, multi-classing is one of my favorite things to discuss in Castles and Crusades.
It's one of my least favorite things to discuss, and that's where we're going to end the episode. Folks, on the next episode, we are going to visit combat again, but this time we're going to talk about options and clarifications. There are some options and choices that have to be made about initiative. There's an issue with polearm use and large creatures. There's casting time questions. There is an explanation of movement types and what kind of movement can you perform in combat. I kind of mentioned that tonight, but not in detail. And then we're going to talk about also those unarmed combat pieces that I mentioned and didn't really hit on. If you would like to have us address a particular topic, you can contact us on Discord. We're on the Troller Games Discord, and you can ping DMSamuel, that's me, or you can ping UltraMagnus, that's George. You can also send an email to dndbrief@gmail.com, and we'd love to have a conversation with you, and we'll try to listen to listener requests and talk about things that are interesting to other people, because that's kind of the point of the podcast. Anything before you sign out, George?
No, I just hope everyone enjoys the game.
Yeah, me too.